Thank you very much. Please sit. I'm honored to welcome Prime Minister Lee of Singapore to the White House today. Thank you, Mr. Prime Minister.
Thank you, President.
I want to thank you for visiting us and your entire group of very, very talented people that we're dealing with. Our friendship has never been stronger than it is right now. Singapore is one of our closest strategic partners in Asia. The United States is proud of the deep and enduring partnership we have built since Singapore gained its independence more than half a century ago. Singapore's rapid development from a poor island nation to an economic powerhouse under the leadership of the Prime Minister's great father. He was a great man. He really was a great man. Has been one of the incredible economic and political achievements of the past 50 years. Singapore's strong commitment to the rule of law, to international property protections, and to the principles of fair and reciprocal, one of my favorite words when it comes to trade, has made the country a magnet for business. Today, over 4,000 American companies are operating in Singapore, and we have a very large trading relationship with Singapore. Earlier today, the Prime Minister and I witnessed a contract signing between Singapore Airlines, a great airline, and Boeing, worth more than $13.8 billion. I want to thank the Singaporean people for their faith in the American engineering and the American workers, and our American workers deliver the best product. By far, our robust partnership extends far beyond economic cooperation and trade. Mr. Prime Minister, as your father rightly noted, the development of the economy is very important, but equally important is the development of the nature of our society. So true. The United States and Singapore share profound belief in a society built on a foundation of law. A nation ruled by law provides the greatest security for the rights of citizens and the best path to shared and lasting prosperity. Both the United States and Singapore understand the unmatched power of private enterprise to uplift the human condition. These values have made our society stronger, sustained our partnership through the Cold War, and laid a critical foundation for our lasting relationship today. Our common values and interests have led to a vital security relationship. Throughout Southeast Asia, the United States and Singapore are currently working to enhance the capacity of law enforcement, fight terrorism, and bolster cyber defenses. Our two nations also share an unwavering commitment to countering the North Korean threat and promoting freedom of navigation in the South China Sea. Singapore was the first Southeast Asian nation to join the coalition to defeat ISIS. That was very far thinking. You were there before most. More than 1,000 of its military personnel train here in the United States every single year. When Hurricane Harvey struck our Gulf Coast in late August, Singapore deployed its own helicopters to help transport personnel and critical resources to areas in need. And the Prime Minister told me that and called me and made that request himself. It was a great help, and we want to thank you very much, the use of your helicopters. When the American Navy destroyer, the USS John McCain, suffered a collision at the sea, Singapore came to our immediate assistance. On behalf of all Americans, I want to thank the Prime Minister and the people of Singapore for their support, which has been tremendous, and for their friendship. In a few weeks, I will attend the U.S.-ASEAN Summit in the Philippines, where we will celebrate the 40th anniversary of U.S.-ASEAN relations. I look forward to continuing our discussions at this year's summit and to seeing the great things Singapore will accomplish as ASEAN chair in 2018. In other words, this great gathering will take place in Singapore in 2018. Mr. Prime Minister, thank you for your continuing partnership and leadership. The U.S.-Singapore relationship has made both of our people far more prosperous and secure, and our values have made us long-standing friends. We are fortunate to have such a wonderful and loyal partner. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to thank President Trump for his very warm hospitality. I'm very happy to visit him in Washington following our first meeting, which was at the G20 summit in Hamburg in July. We had a wide-ranging exchange in the Oval Office and then over lunch. We reaffirmed the robust and enduring partnership between Singapore and the United States over the last 51 years. It's a deep and wide relationship with substantial cooperation in economic, defense, and security spheres. And we also discussed what more we could do to take it forward. On the economic front, the U.S. is an important partner for many countries in Asia, just as Asia is an important economic partner for the United States. Singapore is a small country, we're just 5.5 million, but we have sizable investments and trade with the U.S., and these continue to grow. For example, we are the second largest Asian investor in the U.S., with more than $70 billion in stock investments. And our total trade in goods and services amounted to more than $68 billion last year. The U.S. has consistently run a substantial trade surplus with Singapore. Last year it stood at $18 billion. In other words, America exported $43 billion of goods and services to Singapore, and on a per capita basis, we must be one of the highest buying American customers in the world. $7,500 worth of American goods and services yearly. iPhones, pharmaceutical products, tires, golf clubs, financial and consultancy services. I mean the sticks, not the associations. And I discovered recently, looking at my sports shoes, that my New Balance shoes, which are very good, are made in the US, probably in New England. And of course, we buy Boeing jets. President Trump and I just witnessed a signing between Singapore Airlines and Boeing for SIA to purchase 39 Boeing aircraft worth $13.8 billion US. It's a win-win for both sides. It will further modernize SIA's fleet and also support many American jobs. Our defense ties are very strong. Singapore supports a military presence in Asia. Since 1990, we have hosted USAF and Navy aircraft and ships on rotational deployments. We thank the US for hosting more than 1,000 Singapore military personnel each year in training detachments in the United States. We have forces at Luke Air Force Base in Phoenix and in Marana, also in Arizona, at Mountain Home Air Base in Idaho, at Grand Prairie in Texas, and in Fort Sill, Oklahoma, where I spent 3 months many years ago. In fact, our Chinooks and military personnel in Grand Prairie were deployed to assist in the Hurricane Harvey disaster relief operations, and we are glad to have been of some help to our very gracious hosts. We have a close partnership, too, on security cooperation, including transnational security, terrorism, and cybersecurity. Singapore has lent early and consistent support to the Defeat ISIS coalition. We were one of the first countries to participate and are still the only Asian country to have contributed both military assets and personnel. And as I told President Trump when we met, Singapore will extend our existing deployment to the operation into 2018 for an additional year. President Trump and I naturally discussed the situation on the Korean Peninsula. We strongly oppose the nuclearization of the Korean Peninsula as it affects the peace and stability of the region. And like the US, we condemn the DPRK's dangerous provocations. These pose a serious threat to regional and international peace and stability. I shared with President Trump what Singapore has done to pressure and to isolate the DPRK, going beyond UN Security Council resolutions. But there's no quick and easy solution. Pressure is necessary, but so is dialogue. The US will need to work with others, including China, South Korea, and Japan, and Russia, to resolve the issue. President Trump will be visiting China in a few weeks' time as part of his first visit to Asia. Singapore, like many other countries, watch your relations with China very closely. It's the most important bilateral relationship in the world. China is the U.S.'s third largest export market for both goods and services. For agricultural exports, it's the second largest. They buy soybeans, grains, and cotton, as well as farming machinery. And I'm quite sure that as their incomes go up, they'll buy more and more good American beef. I express my hope that the U.S. will be able to maintain a stable and constructive relationship with China, engaging each other at the highest levels, building trust, establishing institutional mechanisms. Good U.S.-China relations will benefit the region and the world. They will enable countries in the Asia-Pacific, including America and China themselves, to enjoy regional stability, peace, and prosperity. Finally, I look forward to seeing President Trump again in Vietnam and in Philippines next month to attend the APEC and ASEAN and East Asia Summit meetings. His presence in Asia will mean a lot to America's many friends and allies in the region, and it will open doors and develop markets for U.S. exporters and investors. Although the President is not visiting Singapore this time round, I have invited him to visit Singapore at the earliest opportunity, and I'm very glad that he has accepted. Singapore will be the ASEAN chair next year, and we hope to strengthen our ties, ASEAN's ties with the United States, and further ASEAN-US cooperation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
What happened in Niger? Can you tell the public what happened in Niger?
Mr. President, any questions on the ambush?
You have a response to Maisha Johnson, Mr. President. Can you talk to us about Niger, Mr. President?
President Trump in the White House Rose Garden just moments ago as he wraps up an appearance with the Prime Minister of Singapore, avoiding questions about a series of stories that have engulfed his administration over the last couple of days, centering on patriotism, service, and sacrifice. We're going to be talking about it with the entire team. I'm ABC's Rick Klein here in Washington, D.C. But before we get to some of the analysis, I want to play a pretty remarkable exchange on Good Morning America this morning. George Stephanopoulos talking to Maisha Johnson, who is the widow of LaDavid Johnson, who is the sergeant who was killed in Niger, and the phone call that she had with President Trump made all the headlines last week. But take a listen to her account of that phone call.
The president said that he knew what he signed up for, but it hurts anyways. It made me cry because I was very angry at the tone of his voice and how he said it. Like he couldn't remember my husband's name. The only way he remembered my husband's name because he told me he had my husband report in front of him. And that's when he actually said LaDavid. I heard him stumbling on trying to remember my husband's name. And that what hurt me the most, because if my husband is out here fighting for our country and he risks his life for our country, why can't you remember his name?
And that drew a Twitter response from President Trump about an hour after that aired on Good Morning America this morning. The president tweeting, "I had a very respectful conversation with the widow of Sergeant LaDavid Johnson and spoke his name from the beginning without hesitation." He has previously said that the account that was relayed by a congresswoman who listened in on the conversation was inaccurate. Now we have the widow of the sergeant who is backing up that version of events. I want to get to Louis Martinez, who covers the Pentagon for us over at ABC News. And Louis, these conversations, of course, are never going to be easy for any president to hear. How detailed do they typically get? And is there a typical way to even understand what these phone calls entail to begin to understand the differing accounts that we have of them?
Well, you know, last week when we heard from General Kelly, the White House Chief of Staff, when he related his experience and his experience in others, it's a very difficult conversation. It would be for anybody, for that matter. But when it becomes the President of the United States calling a family member who has just gone through a moment of grief because their loved one has been fallen in combat overseas, it's a very significant conversation. You know, one family last week actually released audio of a conversation that they had from back in April when their loved one was one of the fallen in Afghanistan. This was a conversation that President Trump made to the family. The family recorded it on video, and they released that video to some news outlets. Hearing that conversation, one could sense that this was difficult for the president, but at the same time, he was conveying a message of condolences to the family. And the family felt comfortable enough in releasing this because they felt that it showed President Trump sounding sympathetic. It's hard to gauge exactly what went on in this situation. We now have multiple witnesses. We heard from Ms. Johnson today about why she put it on speakerphone, because she wanted her relatives to hear the president addressing the family, express the condolences to them. And that's also listening in was the Congresswoman who was disparaged last week by the White House and has become embroiled in this whole situation. It's become a totally political football. So very difficult conversations for anybody, we can all assume. But for the most part, we are not privy to these. These are totally private conversations, which is understandable.
And Louis, there was another thing that struck me in that interview that George Stephanopoulos did with Maisha Johnson. She complained about not hearing any details of how he was killed. Of course, we know there are ongoing investigations into that. And not even being allowed to view the body. She said that she's made that request and that she wasn't allowed, and anyone could have been in that box. She wants to see her husband's remains. She wants more information. What's your read, and what are Pentagon officials saying about those two things, about what a family of a fallen service member is entitled to learning the circumstances and in viewing the remains?
We'll take those separately, Rick. The first one is the situation involving the information about the incident in which your loved one has become a victim of combat. Typically, the first notification is through a military casualty officer. Throughout the entire grieving process, a military service member is assigned to the family, and they become the primary point of contact for that family in terms of getting through the process and also in providing information. Now, what kind of information gets to that casualty officer? Initial reports are what gets to that officer, and then also that officer provides updates on the follow-on investigations, because every military death, whether it be in combat, accidental, or by some other means, is investigated. And that officer then becomes the liaison to the investigation process. And ultimately, the family is given a copy. First off, they are the first ones to receive those investigations results before they are made public. So I'm not sure where along they are in the process in that, but the casualty officer would be the main link to the family in providing information. Probably because this is an ongoing investigation, they still don't have all the full details. Now, the second point that you asked about the remains, not being allowed to see the remains. I just got off the phone with Dover Air Force Base. That is the central mortuary for the armed forces of the United States. When remains come from overseas, they all end up at Dover. The remains there are processed. We've seen the remains, the caskets covered in flags, being taken off of large transport planes and being loaded into vehicles. The family members are typically there. In order for them to get access to the base, they have to sign paperwork. Included in the paperwork, there is a line there that says that they will not be allowed access to the remains while they are at Dover. That is standard. Some exceptions can be made to family members, but it is standard that the families do not get access to the remains at Dover Air Force Base. Once the autopsy has been concluded, once the embalming has been done, once the preparing of the remains has been done, then the remains are transferred to the family. At that point, the family has access to the remains if they want. Sometimes the military can, the Air Force Mortuary Office can make a recommendation based on the status of the remains, whether it would be appropriate for the family to view it or not, but ultimately it is up to the family. And then at that point, the family works with the funeral director of the funeral home where the remains are at, and they can gain access. It's unclear if this is what happened here, whether the family, there was some communication there, but ultimately it is up to the family is allowed to view the remains once they are at the funeral home. And if they are wrapped, which is one of the things that she termed, that may be because the remains are not, they may be in a high state of trauma. And they, for convenience for the family, they are wrapped in plastic sheeting, in a linen, and then a wool blanket. And then their uniform is laid on top of that into the casket. But the military can work with the funeral directors to show a limited portion, expose that, unwrapped for the unwrapping so that the family can see the remains. Complicated, but very important.
Yeah, and Louis, stick with us. So there's a lot to unpack in all of this. And of course, the president's decision to engage is what makes this a story all over again. It was a week ago that President Trump was out there in that same Rose Garden, an impromptu press conference that kicked off this rather extraordinary 7 days that just had this whole discussion about how previous presidents have handled this. I want to turn to Catherine Faulders over at the White House. You just saw the president not answering any new questions on this, but this really has been a self-created controversy from the start. And what's striking to me, Catherine, is that they thought they put this to rest with John Kelly late last week. It looked like he would have the final word. Then you hear from the family, and then the president firing right back on Twitter again.
Oh, right, exactly. As you mentioned, this is something that was started by the president a week ago when he was just asked why he didn't respond earlier enough to these controversies. And as you mentioned, it was a self-created issue here, and he decided to compare himself to other presidents here. And here we are a week later still talking about it. You know, it begs the question that if he never brought this up by himself Monday in the Rose Garden, if we would still be talking, about this right now, if the Congresswoman Wilson would have responded on the phone call here. So a self-created controversy by the president, I'd say, about 7 days ago, with John Kelly coming out and addressing reports in the briefing room last week, saying that he told the president what to say here, and that he told the president also that some other presidents don't make phone calls; they have their own way of doing things, and that he instructed the president to maybe not make these phone calls. So that wasn't supposed to be taken in a negative way, which the president painted that a negative picture here on Monday, Rick. So absolutely right. Here we are 7 days later, still talking about something that he created.
That's right. And since then, there's been a new one over the weekend. Senator John McCain giving an interview to C-SPAN talking about the Vietnam War. And he made a rather pointed comment that a lot of people viewed as a direct dig at President Trump, talking about how upper-income people during Vietnam were able to get things like a letter from doctors about bone spurs. Now, he said that wasn't about President Trump, but that is how President Trump has described the way that he avoided the draft around the Vietnam War. John McCain was on The View today and was asked the question about whether he viewed President Trump to be a draft dodger.
We had the draft, and someone's name would come up, and if they were wealthy, many times, they would go to a doctor, and the doctor would say, okay, you've got migraines.
Yeah.
So that would go to the draft board, and they would be excused.
Yeah. Right.
What about the farm? What about the inner city person?
Yeah.
What about all of those who didn't have a doctor to go to or somebody of influence
They
to get
thought
them
they
out?
were expendable.
Well,
Yes.
People thought you were talking about
Trump.
Mr. Trump because he had a doctor's note that said he had bone spurs.
I think
and
more
he,
than once, yes.
More than once.
Chronic bone spurs.
Do you consider him a draft dodger?
I don't consider him so much a draft dodger as I feel that the system was so wrong that certain Americans could evade their responsibilities to serve the country.
Now, pointedly, President John McCain decided to particularly cite that particular incident, and that happened to align with President Trump. You have to think that he knew what he was doing. When you talk about John McCain, it's a guy that's been in the public eye. This is a man who understands the news cycle. Catherine, this isn't the first time that the two of them have tangled either.
And no, it's absolutely not the first time the two of them have tangled. You remember even last week that the President Trump warned John McCain that he fights back, is what the president said, after McCain questioned America's foreign policy with pretty pointed comments towards the president. So not the first time. You have to wonder exactly, like, does John McCain know what he was talking about here? Obviously, viewed as a veiled swipe at Trump, who said he had this bone spur ailment and was exempted from the military during the war in the 1960s. Of course, John McCain says that wasn't the case, and his spokespeople say that he wasn't referring to President Trump, but absolutely, over the past week, there has been a little bit of back and forth between the president and John McCain. We haven't heard from the president since last week, on John McCain, so we've asked, of course, the White House for comment on that. We haven't heard from them, but definitely a little back and forth between the two here, Rick.
And John Verhoeven, it's been a rather extraordinary couple of days because it's not just John McCain. We heard last week from President Obama as well as President Bush, neither of whom mentioned particularly Donald Trump, but both of whom seem to be talking very specifically about things that are happening under the Trump era, even behavior exhibited by this president. It seems like there's a whole series of political figures, Johnny, who are coming out now to call out Trumpism, if not particularly Trump himself.
Absolutely. You saw President Obama last week campaigning in Virginia for a gubernatorial candidate there. And you wrote about this last week, Rick, but, you see these former presidents, and you saw another show of unity this weekend with all 5 living former ex-presidents going to a fundraiser for Hurricane Harvey victims. And you see them sort of trying to elevate the dialogue in the country, and you see them sort of trying to advocate for a politics of unity and not for a politics of division. And, even watching those events, it's pretty clear who they were talking about, even if they don't, want to mention him by name. And, it's hard, and I think you see a lot of Republicans even and other, political figures. It's hard to see the president tweeting back at Maisha Johnson, the widow of LaDavid Johnson, and sort of trying to litigate this over Twitter. It's hard to see how that elevates this dialogue and brings us back to a politics, that President Obama and President Bush were talking about, Rick.
And Louis Martinez, how is this going over at the Pentagon? John McCain is one of the most respected members of the United States Senate, the chairman of the Armed Services Committee, very close relationships with top brass, top generals at the Pentagon. How is that, plus this bizarre 7 days where you're talking about how presidents have handled the worst news that you possibly could have to deliver to an American? I can't imagine we've seen many circumstances like this in the past, but I'm curious what the buzz is among people who work in the military for a living. This is their life, and they see these debates play out in public.
Yeah, it's extraordinary to see this out in public. But I would go to the McCain angle first. One of the things we noticed was on Friday, all of a sudden there was this new addition to the secretary's schedule, which was that he was going to go up to Capitol Hill to meet with Senator John McCain, who is the chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee. McCain had been complaining that he and his leadership had not gotten enough details about what was going on in Niger. They wanted not only the incident details, but also the broader picture of what exactly is going on with the U.S. presence in West Africa. That shows you the significance of McCain's comments received with over here. Now, in terms of the broader picture of what the idea of what's going on or how this is being aired publicly, I can tell you that some service members that I've spoken to are concerned about it. They want to make sure that they get to the bottom of what actually happened there in Niger, because there's a lot of confusion internally about exactly what happened. There are several narratives about how large the team was, whether they were chasing off after a high-value target inside of Mali, insurgents on motorcycles that they were chasing, whether they were set up as a trap. All of those things are pieces of information that the U.S. military wants to get a handle on, and quickly. And there's a little bit of frustration because there are too many narratives coming out, and those officers that I'm speaking with, they want to get a grasp on it, and they can't get it now almost 2.5 weeks later. But then the whole relationship with the discussion about the families, this is unnerving to them because they all know how the process works. They want the American public to be educated about it, but at the same time, I think there's concern that the back and forth is unseemly, especially since this is one of America's fallen who is at the very center of all this.
Yeah, it's an awkward way to have a national conversation. I want to hit one other detail from John McCain's conversation on The View, because he was asked a little bit about the relationship that he has with President Trump. Of course, as you mentioned, Louis, the chairman of the Armed Services Committee, one of the most powerful and most respected members of the United States Senate. This is what he had to say about his relationship with the president.
I think the point is that we need to have a kinder, more respectful, but vigorous debate and discussion, but based on what we want the country to do, not whether somebody's a jerk or not.
Right.
You know, so go ahead.
I was just going to say, do you talk to him regularly? Like, we hear things in the news about the back and forth. Do you guys talk on the phone? Do you chat with him? What's your relationship like with the president?
Almost none.
Yeah.
Zero.
Okay.
Wow.
Terrible.
Almost none.
In any other presidency, in any other context, this might be absolutely shocking. Catherine Faulders, any reaction from the White House on this and what they can do about having no relationship at all with the chairman of the Armed Services Committee?
A pretty remarkable comment there from John McCain, that he has almost no relationship with the President of the United States. They don't they don't speak on the phone. This president doesn't reach out to McCain. It seems like they don't talk at all. We've asked the White House for reaction to this, when the last time they've spoken and been in touch, and so far we haven't heard anything from them on that. But Rick, definitely a question that they're going to need to answer, as John McCain is a critical person up on the Hill for this president to be talking to regularly, you'd think.
You would think, once again, you would think. All right, Catherine Faulders, Louis Martinez, John Verhoeven, thank you all for joining. Thank you all for watching. That does it for here from ABC News. We'll have more as the day goes on here at ABC News. I'm ABC News Political Director Rick Klein.